Okay, well, I'm going to share with you some work that was spearheaded by my graduate student, Justin Wu. He unfortunately couldn't be here today. He's about to graduate and move on to a job at Sandia. And he supervised a number of students that worked on this project as a collaborative effort. What we're really interested in looking at is how do we help users choose behaviors that enhance their security and privacy. And the emphasis there is on the word choose. We're not looking at areas where compliance is in place in a workplace where people are kind of forced or required to do something secure or private, but really where are they going to actually choose on their own to adopt some behavior. And we're looking at the general public here. And the example that we used for our study was to look at the authentication ceremony in secure messaging apps, specifically Signal and applications that are based on the Signal protocol like WhatsApp. And so I'm going to give you a quick tour through what we mean by the authentication ceremony and how this works in Signal. So here is an example of two users. I'm using Aisha and Booker. They both installed the Signal app on their phones, and you see that they were both assigned a public and private key pair. I'm denoting Aisha's in sort of this gold colored and Booker's in the blue colored key. When they register their app with Signal, when they register their phone with the Signal server, they're going to share their public key with the Signal server. And so here's Aisha doing it, and here's Booker doing it. Then at some later point in time, when they want to talk to each other, Aisha needs to download Booker's public key from the Signal server, and Booker needs to do the same thing for Aisha. Then at some point in time when they begin their conversation, they're going to derive a secret key for the conversation. They're going to combine the yellow and the blue keys to derive, here I'm showing a black key, to derive a secret key. Booker will do the same thing as Aisha. And then they will use this key to begin communicating with each other using encrypted messages. And there's some details here in terms of how Signal ratchets those keys. It continually changes those keys over time. But the basic idea here is that we need to start with public keys that are correct for those two users. And from there, we can derive secret keys to encrypt messages in the conversation. But we have to beware. We might have an attacker who tries to break into the system. So here I'm showing our elite hacker who has broken into the Signal server. And what this hacker is going to do is she's going to give a red key to Aisha, claiming that that is Booker's key, and a red key to Booker, claiming that it's Aisha's public key. And then she's going to have them derive their secret keys. We have Aisha deriving sort of a dark gray and Booker deriving a light gray key. And now she's going to sit in the middle of that conversation. She's going to be using the dark key to talk with Aisha and the light gray key to talk with Booker and be able to intercept those messages so that she can listen in on all the messages. She can potentially even change messages in this conversation. So how are we going to help Aisha and Booker to foil the attacker? Inside of Signal, there's something called the Authentication Ceremony. They should be able to take their two public keys and combine them. There's an algorithm Signal uses to take parts of their public keys and derive what Signal calls safety numbers, which are key fingerprints. And Booker is going to be able to do the same thing independently of Aisha. And so they need to somehow get together and compare these key fingerprints, the safety numbers, and make sure that they match. They have to do that by scanning a QR code if they happen to be in the same place, or maybe making a phone call and reading these long numbers over a phone call to make sure that they match. We refer to this as the authentication ceremony. They're authenticating each other. And if they've received keys from this hacker who's broken into the Signal server, then they will be computing different safety numbers and they won't match. Okay. So it turns out there's been research done on this, quite a few papers I can cite there, and not too surprisingly, users don't perform that authentication ceremony organically, and even if we prompt them to do it, they don't complete it properly and they don't really understand the importance of it or what this is doing to protect their privacy. Our prior approach that we published last year at SOUPS was to try to get everyone to always complete the authentication ceremony. And we used opinionated design to try to encourage users to really push them towards, hey, you should do this ceremony. And we focused on adherence rates and timing to try to get that to be as fast as possible. So there's some advantages to that approach. We did managed to show that you can increase security this way. We get more people doing the ceremony. It's really easy to measure adherence to see how many people are doing it. You can measure time to completion and see how fast it takes to do it. But there's a real drawback here in that we're ignoring perception of risk from the users. We're requiring them to do this ceremony even if they think, oh, this particular conversation is not particularly important. And we're ignoring response costs. So we're trying to push them to do something that does take some meaningful time and effort when they may consider that effort to be wasted if they don't perceive a genuine risk here. It turns out that almost always your security number should change because one of you reinstalled Signal, not because there was a hacker present there. I'm not aware of any particular case where Signal or some secure messaging service like WhatsApp has been hacked in the way of we're going to actually make these safety numbers change. So what this means is that response cost is high and risk is low, and that's a bad situation in which you're going to force everyone to follow through on this. There's a great quote from Angela Sass in this paper a number of years ago that says, "Security that routinely diverts the attention and disrupts the activities of users in pursuit of their primary goals is thus the antithesis of a user-centered approach." Okay, and she called this bullying users into having strong security or privacy practices. So our approach is grounded in a theory called risk communication. This has been used extensively in areas of public health. And the idea is to help users understand the likelihood of a risk as well as the severity of the risk, and then also help them understand response efficacy. What action could they take that would mitigate that risk? And how well does that response actually address their concern? And also understand response costs. So how much is this going to cost them? And success comes in risk communication not if everyone adheres to best practices, but instead if users are making informed choices that align with their own values and perceptions. So if someone perceives, for example, in our situation, that this is a conversation that's not particularly important, and so they're not concerned about doing the authentication ceremony, that's in alignment and we're okay with that. But if they do perceive that the risk is likely and severe, then we're hoping that they should also perceive there's this response that they can use, and we should see them follow through and do the authentication ceremony in that case. Okay. So our work consists of 3 parts. The first part was to evaluate warnings in Signal to see how good they are at risk communication. We did both a cognitive walkthrough and a fairly extensive lab user study to study how well their existing warnings were. We then took what we learned and developed improvements that involved some mechanical Turk studies to design those improvements, as well as a simulated Signal experience so that we could sample with a large number of mechanical Turk users, walking them through this to see how well they understood it. And then we evaluated our new design that resulted by also using some of that data from the simulated Signal experience and then repeating our lab user study with a new set of users to see if their behavior changed and if their understanding changed. Unfortunately, there's way too much in the paper for me to go through and cover all of that for you. So instead, I'm going to cover the highlights in 3 areas. What things did we find were wrong with Signal? What did we do to fix them? And how well did our improvements fix things? Okay, to guide you through that, it's getting a little late in the afternoon, so we're going to use Doctor Who to help signal that we're getting to a new part of the talk. So here is the very best Doctor Who portrayal by Jodie Whittaker. And that she's looking vaguely worried that there might be some areas for improvement in Signal. And so I'm going to walk you through some of those areas of concern. Okay. We diagrammed in our cognitive walkthrough every single interaction between every single screen in Signal. And this is a subset of that very large picture showing just the interactions for how you would get to the authentication ceremony in Signal. If you walk through this, there's actually 3 different ways, 3 different scenarios in which you can get to the authentication ceremony. There is this top path, which happens in certain situations, and then you end up having your message not be delivered. It's like your cell phone connection was broken, and so the message isn't delivered. There's a little warning there, and if you click on that warning, it says, well, your safety numbers with Alice have changed. This could mean that someone is trying to intercept the communications, or it could be that Alice simply reinstalled Signal, gives a link to the authentication ceremony, and then these accept and cancel buttons. So that's one flow through here. The bottom flow is when the numbers change in the middle of a conversation with someone. Signal considers this to be more alarming. And so it instead, this is the bottom flow. And so in this case, it just simply puts a warning message in there. So there's a very little warning message at the bottom saying your safety number with Alice has changed. Otherwise, you can continue communicating. And then we have this flow here, which does actually block the message. You're in the middle of sending your message. When you press the send button, then it says, whoa, wait a minute, your safety numbers has changed. Do you really want to send this message? It does not give you a link to the authentication ceremony, and then you can click send or cancel here if you want to go ahead and send your message or not. Okay. So we took all of this and put this into a user study. We walked users through different scenarios and then investigated what their perceptions of risk were and response efficacy and whether they understood what was being shown here. And what we found was some really unclear risk communication. So if you take a look at this warning here, it's saying that some issues need your attention and Alice has a new safety number. And we have regularly found, as we've done user studies with Signal, that users don't know what a safety number is. They don't know what it means that the safety number has changed. And so there's no way for them to perceive what is the risk going on here. Why am I at risk here? What exactly is that risk? How likely is it? How severe is it? There's just not a lot for them to go on to judge how severe this warning is. When they go through and start clicking through some of these dialogues don't communicate response costs. So we're not really telling users this is what it's going to take to verify their safety numbers, how long it will take. You need to be in the same room or you need to make a phone call. These things are not communicated. The consequences of actions are not clear. It turns out that if you're sending messages that just don't go through, and then you pop up this dialog that says, hey, your safety number has changed, if you click accept here, it actually sends all of your backlog messages, which is maybe not a good thing to do if the conversation is being intercepted. And it's just not clear that that's going to happen. If you do happen to get to the authentication ceremony, the implications of success or failure are not clear. So if these numbers don't match, if you scan them with the QR code, you get a big red X, but then it doesn't tell you anything after that. And if they do match, it doesn't say, oh, this is what that means that they match. That means you're talking to the right person, for example. There's this little toggle button that you're supposed to switch only if you make sure that the safety numbers match. And people just turn that toggle on and say, oh, that must have verified my contact. Magic, my conversation looks secure now. And so they don't really understand, no, they were supposed to check before toggling. Okay, so here's Jody Whittaker again. Now she's looking pleased because she has seen our improvements to Signal. And so we're going to walk through what we did to change Signal. We simplified that complicated diagram down to a single flow. So we have one possible flow. If the safety numbers ever change for any reason, we will block the very next message that you send and not allow it to go through. We have some data to back up that choice as to why that was a good choice. We then use positive framing for the authentication ceremony. We use the terms privacy check. We are going to encourage you to check your privacy in this case. And everything around the ceremony is framed around positive words. So if that succeeds, then the privacy check means that your privacy is guaranteed. We also communicate response costs. We tell them right up front that this is going to take a few minutes for them to do and that they need to either be in the same room or make a phone call with the person that they're talking to. We clearly label their choices. They can say, oh, not now, or yes, I do want to get started with that right now. So it's very clear what they're choosing to do instead of just okay or cancel. Then if they click not now, we give them the option to be reminded later that they might want to do it at some later point in time. If they click get started, we go to a new authentication ceremony screen. We changed the safety number terminology to instead talk about device identifiers. That's based on some work we did last year on mental modeling. And when people think of encryption, they think of it as a permission or a blocking access. And so we're trying to cast the authentication ceremony instead in terms of granting access to your device. So we split that safety number up, and we also divided it into two parts, your identifier, the other person's identifier, and then we grouped the numbers into groups of 3 to reduce cognitive load. So now instead of saying that I have to read 479006, I can read 4796 and so forth. One of the biggest complaints we've had in the number of studies we've done is the length of the safety numbers. And so this way it's really only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 10 numbers they have to read, and then have their partner read 10 numbers, which is much shorter than having to read the longer number all out. Okay. We communicated about success and failure and what they should do in those cases. If failure occurs, we give them a warning and say you probably shouldn't talk to this person if you're using sensitive information in the conversation. And if it works, we give them a privacy verified logo. We redesigned icons, and so we have a new icon that appears in the header with the 3 different states, the default state, the verified state, and the unsafe state, indicating whether this particular conversation is safe or not. You can actually click on that icon, and it will lead to a dialog to say, hey, you can do the privacy check if you want to verify your conversation. If you are verified, it will click and tell you, yes, you are verified. If you want to go back and double check, you can do that. And if it failed, you can click and say, there's this big warning here, don't communicate any sensitive information with this contact. Okay. All right, now Jody is telling us it's time to do some experiments and see how well these improvements actually worked. We did a user study where we modified the signal source code to simulate a man-in-the-middle at our desire. So we were sitting by as study coordinators with a button we could push to say man-in-the-middle right now. We had 4 groups of people that came in pairs. Each group walked through one of these 4 flows, the 3 original flows and our newly designed flow. So we had 60 pairs or 120 participants altogether with 15 pairs doing each flow. We asked them, did you perceive any risk while you were using this app? This was all during a non-risky scenario. So they were just talking about a vacation that they had, and then we turned on the man-in-the-middle. And we were able to show that 2/3 of the users in the new design perceived a risk. In the middle flow, the flow where the message just goes through and there's a little notification of the shield notification, very few people noticed that at all. And we had noticed the message block flow worked pretty well, and that was why we were working with the blocking flow in our case too. Okay. We asked people then, oh, you perceived a risk, what did you do to cope with the risk? And we're really hoping our risk communication worked, and they say, oh, I should do the privacy check if my privacy is at risk. And no, actually, that was not what they chose. They said, oh, I'm going to avoid talking about anything sensitive. They said, I'm going to just use a phone call. They said, oh, I should verify my contact, like I'll call them on the phone and make sure that's them on the other line. I'll check my app permissions. Some of them even said, oh, I'll switch to Facebook Messenger, which is not a good idea. Only 2 of them said, oh, I should use the privacy check. So there's still a lot of work to be done here to actually get people to understand response efficacy. We walked them through what this particular dialogue meant to them. Nearly everybody did associate it with a potential threat. Those who acted on it said, oh, I'm checking because I am checking for a threat, or because it's better to be safe than sorry. And those who didn't act said, well, the risk was minimal, or the privacy check was too inconvenient. So that actually had a strong alignment with what we're trying to do here in terms of risk communication. We also asked them, what do they think verifying the safety number or performing the privacy check actually accomplishes? And we checked their answers for accuracy, and we graded them either correct or partially correct or incorrect. On the left is the original design, and on the right is the new design. So you can see that we increased correct answers, and we decreased the number of people who had an incorrect answer or didn't know. So that was a good result. We also asked them, what does it mean when safety numbers match? Had more mixed result here. We had more correct answers and fewer partially correct answers, but we also increased the number of people who didn't know. So we have some work to be done there. We asked them, what does it mean if they don't match? And we had some pretty good results there in terms of increasing correct answers. But still a lot of room to go. We had about 50% giving correct answers in all 3 cases. And we'd like to get more than that. All right, so now Jody is very surprised. Wow, what did we learn about risk communication then? there must be some great stuff here. We learned we can design for understanding. We learned that there can be good alignment between perception of risk and actually acting on risk. But we also learned there's a lot of work needed on response efficacy, helping people know how to cope with the risk in this particular case. We had one user say, something isn't secure, but I'm not sure how that translates into a problem. So this indicates perception of risk severity actually is an important component of choosing privacy protecting behaviors. We had someone say, though it's only about fish, that's really not cool with me. They were talking about the fish that they had photographed on their vacation in Hawaii. And so this showed that users do have different risk profiles. Some people, it is not cool if there's interception going on, even if they're only just talking about fish. And we had someone say, if it was easy enough, I would be happy to secure my conversation, but at the same time, how necessary is it? So this is indicating a mix there of risk severity being low and also being worried about response cost. Okay. Now suppose we automate the authentication ceremony. What if we could somehow make this all not visible to the user? That could potentially help differentiate between when someone reinstalled versus an actual definite threat. But we're still going to need warnings when a threat is detected. We're still going to have users with different risk profiles deciding how they're going to react to that threat, and users still need guidance with coping strategies to know what to do if that threat occurs. And it turns out that user strategies for coping with online threats extend beyond the ecosystem of your app. So when we're giving people advice, we need to focus not just on what should they do with this app to be safer, but what could they do in the broader sense if they're not using my app. Okay. So our future work is to look at better design for understanding, especially looking at better response efficacy. And we're also really interested in studying different risk scenarios. All of ours were students at a university, and so we're really interested in studying different populations that might be at risk and giving them a scenario where they actually are at risk, simulated, and seeing whether this design helps them better protect themselves. So now you're all really fascinated by risk communication, designing for understanding, so we'll all celebrate with Jody Whittaker. And if you'd like to learn more or replicate our work, we have all of our data and our studies available for you to replicate if you'd like. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That was a really fantastic talk. A couple questions. If anyone else has one, please interrupt. Did you look at all the impact of understanding in terms of group chats where safety numbers may change much more frequently since there's more members who might lose a phone or uninstall the app?
That is one area we did not look at. So that's a great place to go next.
And then I noticed the particular wording in your privacy check said that there's a small chance that it presented some clearer information. Did you consider the scenarios that the risk might change over time? Specifically, GCHQ has been talking about inserting ghost users into end-to-end group chats as one way to try to get around the end-to-end. So as things like that may or may not happen, the risk could change over time?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We were basing our messaging on the risk based on our understanding of risk now, that this actually is a very low risk, especially in Signal right now. But yes, moving forward, if that risk profile changed, then we would need to change the messaging there and potentially make it more in the vein of types of warning design that you've seen for like certificate errors on the web, something that would catch people's attention more, because that would be more threatening and more likely that it would be severe.
Mm-hmm. Just one last question. You mentioned everything's available to replicate. Thanks so much for that. I know that Keybase has a different security model where they can cryptographically verify the public attestations that someone has put forward. How do you think this research might change for an app like that that has a different security model?
Oh, that's a good one. I'll talk to you offline about that because, yeah, that's going to change quite a bit once you move into a different area. We've looked at risk communication for secure email is sort of the next step that we're going, but Keybase would be another really interesting place to look at there, and yeah, it changes there.
Thanks a lot. Great talk. Appreciate it.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering if you were able to measure if users if some of them just ignored the text or if they found it too wordy, and how to mitigate against that in the future?
Oh, great question. We worked really hard to shorten our text. When we were originally developing the text, it was really long. And we worked really hard to say, no, we get one sentence for the risk and one sentence for response cost. But we didn't have a way of measuring whether people actually read the text. And we didn't want to ask them because they would probably just tell us, yes, they did. And so that might be a case where you might use an eye tracker or maybe screen recording to try to understand, were people actually paying attention to the text, that particular text there? And we just didn't have enough room in our study to measure that. It's a good thing to look at.
Hi, Tamara Denning, University of Utah, neighbor. So you showed 3 icons, right? One was for default assumed secure, one was for verified, and one was for alarmed incident something.
Yeah.
I was curious, and I haven't read your paper, so I don't know, if you discussed at all the possibility of doing a question mark for the unknown but assumed unverified state?
We did. I don't remember if that was one of the ones we tested. So we actually did some tests on Turk looking at people's responses to icons, and we tested, I want to say, a dozen different icons. I remember a question mark being in the mix there. I don't remember if we ended up including that one. But if we go to the paper, we can see some data on the question mark there. We definitely thought about that, and we looked at how much worry it gave people and how much concern it gave people. We're trying to get a neutral icon for default state without a ton of worry, because it is supposed to be safe, assuming they weren't hacked right from the very beginning.
Oh, thanks, awesome. So in the paper?
Yeah, so there should be, I think, a question mark, some data on the question mark icon in the paper.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Tom Marr from Oracle. This is wonderful. Have you talked to Whisper Systems about, this informing the next version of Signal and their UI design?
Not yet. That is on our list of things we would like to do.
Great. Also, a bit of warning, I would be extremely cautious about trying to automate the authentication ceremony.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing that leaks side channels everywhere, and if your threat model is, I don't want anyone to know I have any contact with this person, not even just the payload.
Good. Thank you.